I want you to do something for me right now. No, really. I want you to actively participate in a little physical exercise.
Just a quick one.
Yeah, exactly. Just wherever you happen to be right now, just sit for a moment. Take your eyes off whatever else you were doing, like if you're washing dishes or looking at a screen, and really just notice the physical environment around you.
Take it in.
Right. Notice the light coming from a window or, maybe the glow of the screen right in front of you. Notice the wall behind your shoulders. Pay attention to the exact direction your knees are pointing.
Think about the space behind your head, too.
Oh, yeah. That area you can't actually see, but you just absolutely know is there. It doesn't really take any effort at all, does it?
No, it's automatic.
You just instantly, intuitively know exactly where you are in the space. You map it out effortlessly using this very specific language. The language of, here and there, to your left, to your right, in front of you and behind you.
It's all based on you.
Exactly. The entire room, the whole architecture of the space you are currently occupying is organized entirely around your body. Wherever you happen to be right now listening to this deep dive, you exist at the absolute center of your own universe. Everything else is just relative to you.
And that feeling, right, that deep-seated, totally intuitive sense of being the anchor point for the physical world, that is what we generally consider to be the ultimate default setting of human experience.
So, it's just how human beings work.
Right. It feels so natural, so biological, that we don't even bother to question it. I mean, we move through the world assuming that a body in a room is always the center of that room. We just assume this is how the human brain processes geometry.
But the reason I am asking you to sit there and do this little physical exercise, to really feel your body at the center of the room, is because of a source text we are diving into today that completely challenges that exact assumption.
It really turns it upside down.
It does. It is a field note from a writer calling themselves the Alien Anthropologist, and the piece is titled The Carrier and the Compass. So, the mission of this deep dive today is to explore a concept that might, frankly, completely rewire how you view your own mind.
It's a big one.
It is. We are asking a very strange, very deep question. What if the way we talk, the specific language we use to interact with the physical world, doesn't just describe our reality after the fact?
Right. What if it's more active?
Exactly. What if it actively, physically shapes our biology? What if language dictates our actual, literal capacity to perceive the universe around us?
Because we're going to look at what this author describes as an invisible, ongoing loss of human perceptual abilities.
Yeah.
And we really need to be incredibly precise about what that actually means.
Yeah, clarify that for us.
Well, when we usually talk about losing languages or losing cultural practices, we frame it as losing information.
Right.
We think of it as losing an encyclopedia of interesting trivia or, a collection of local folklore.
Like losing a really good book.
Exactly. But the argument here is far more biological. The text suggests we aren't just losing data, we are losing the actual organs required to understand the world.
Organs? Like physical organs?
Yes, we're losing the actual physical and cognitive structures that allow human beings to interface with reality in fundamentally different ways.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Actually,
Because to truly understand how a language can act like a physical organ, like a literal eyeball or an ear that detects something you and I are just completely blind to, we have to take a trip.
we have to go to Australia.
Right, to Hopevale. This is an indigenous community situated on the North Queensland coast. And the doorway into this entirely different way of perceiving reality actually starts with this wild historical misunderstanding from the 1700s.
Yeah, if we go all the way back to 1770, Captain James Cook's ship, the HMS Endeavour, was damaged on the Great Barrier Reef.
They had a rough time.
They really did. They had to beach the ship on the coast of Queensland for repairs. And during the weeks they spent there, Cook's crew encountered the local indigenous people, the Guugu Yimithirr.
And they had this really famous interaction, right?
Right. The crew recorded a word they heard the locals using to describe a large hopping marsupial. And the word they wrote down in their journals was gangaroo.
Which obviously eventually becomes the English word kangaroo. And the British thought they had just done some basic one-to-one translation. They pointed at an animal, heard a sound, wrote it down, and thought, great, we grabbed a souvenir word.
They thought they were just dealing with a different set of labels for the exact same reality.
But they completely missed the architecture of the mind that was actually producing that word. The language of the Guugu Yimithirr was doing something entirely different with reality. And it took 2 whole centuries for anyone from the outside world to actually realize it.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 1970s that an anthropologist and linguist named John Haviland really began to decode the underlying structure of Guugu Yimithirr.
He actually went and lived there, right?
He did. He went to Hopevale, lived with the community, and started paying close, really obsessive attention to how the speakers talked about space. And Haviland eventually noticed that something fundamental to the English language was entirely absent from their speech.
Like a whole category of words just missing.
Exactly. If you or I are describing a scene, we use what linguists call relative spatial words. We say, the keys are to my left, or the door is behind me.
Right.
The object's location is entirely dependent on which way I happen to be facing at that exact moment. But Haviland realized that Guugu Yimithirr has absolutely no words for left or right in that bodily sense.
Wow.
There's no concept of in front of or behind meaning relative to the speaker.
So if they are in a room and they literally can't say, the door's behind me, how do they function? I mean, how do they tell someone where anything is?
Well, because instead of relative terms, they orient themselves and literally every single object around them using absolute coordinates.
Absolute coordinates.
Right. They use Gunga for north, Jiba for south, Naga for east, and Guya for west.
And I want to make sure we don't gloss over this because, we hear north and south and we instantly think of maps or compasses. We think of hiking. But they use these terms at the most microscopic scales of daily life.
That is the crucial distinction to make here. We are not talking about navigational language reserved for long journeys across the outback. We are talking about the language used to navigate a kitchen table.
Imagine you are just sitting at dinner. You want someone to pass the salt. You don't say, hey, can you pass the salt on your left? You would have to say, the salt is on the western edge of the table. Pass it eastward.
Exactly.
Or, okay, imagine you see a bug crawling on your friend. You don't say, watch out, there is a spider on your left shoulder. You have to say, there is a spider on your southwestern shoulder. And then if they turn around in a panic, it's suddenly on their northwestern shoulder.
Right, the coordinate changes because the shoulder moved relative to the earth.
It sounds completely exhausting to an English speaker. It sounds like you are forcing your brain to act like a GPS satellite just to have a casual conversation about a spider.
And that reaction, that feeling of exhaustion you get just imagining it, that highlights exactly what is happening cognitively. If we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the immense cognitive load this requires of a speaker.
It must be massive.
To converse in this language, to even form a basic sentence about where a cup of water is, you must possess a constant ambient knowledge of which way is which. You literally cannot construct a grammatically correct sentence in Guugu Yimithirr without knowing where north is.
Wait, so how do they actually do that? Like, if they are inside a windowless room, or if it's the middle of the night and they can't see the sun or the stars, do they just get lost? Do they have to stop talking?
No, they don't get lost.
How do they calibrate, though? Because if I close my eyes right now and spin around in my office chair a few times, I have absolutely no idea where north is anymore.
That's because you rely on visual cues. But for them, it's not something they have to consciously calibrate. It is an ambient tracking.
Ambient tracking.
Think about how you and I track gravity. You don't have to stop what you're doing. Look at a dropping object, calculate the trajectory, and then remind yourself which way is down.
Right, I just feel it.
Exactly. Your body simply tracks it continuously through your vestibular system in your inner ear. For a native speaker of Guugu Yimithirr, who was raised in this linguistic framework from birth, absolute direction is tracked in the exact same way.
Because it's running in the background.
Their brain has essentially built a background process that constantly updates their orientation relative to the cardinal directions. No matter how many times they turn, no matter if they are indoors or in pitch black darkness, it is an ever-present physical reality.
So to prove this wasn't just some linguistic quirk where they were just using different vocabulary for the same mental process, Haviland and another cognitive anthropologist, Stephen Levinson, set up this fascinating experiment.
I love this experiment.
It's so clever. They wanted to test if this language actually altered the physical mechanics of memory itself. So they gathered participants. Some were English speakers and some were Guugu Yimithirr speakers. They put a participant in a room and showed them an array of objects arranged on a table. So, for example, let's say they set up a toy man facing a toy tree. The participant studies the table for a minute. Then, the researchers walk the participant out of the room, lead them down a winding hallway and into a completely different room.
And here's the trick.
Right. Crucially, during this walk, the participant is rotated exactly 180 degrees from their original orientation. So if they were facing north in the first room, they're now facing south in the second room.
Yes.
The researchers hand them the toys and say, recreate the scene exactly as you saw it.
And the contrast in the results, beautifully illustrates the difference between relative and absolute perception. The speakers of relative frame languages, like the English speakers, almost universally reproduce the array based on their own bodies.
So if the toy man was on their right side in room A, they put it on their right side in room B.
Exactly. So if the toy man was on the participant's right in the first room, they placed him on their right in the second room. But because the participant had been rotated 180 degrees, by keeping the array consistent with their body, they had actually built the scene entirely backwards relative to the true compass directions of the Earth.
Oh, wow.
They reversed the physical reality of the array to maintain the relative reality of their egocentric perspective.
They prioritized their own body over the room, but the Guugu Yimithirr speakers did the exact opposite. They reproduced the scene based purely on absolute coordinates.
They ignored their bodies entirely.
Yeah. If the toy man was placed to the north of the tree in the first room, they placed him to the north of the tree in the second room. They completely ignored the fact that their own body was now facing a different wall. They built the array perfectly relative to the Earth, entirely bypassing their own physical orientation.
What's fascinating here is that we cannot look at this and simply say they made a different choice in how to solve a puzzle.
It's deeper than that.
The neurological implication is much deeper. These two groups of people perceived entirely different scenes from the very moment they looked at the table.
The English speaker's brain encoded the memory as a man to my right.
Right. And the Guugu Yimithirr speaker's brain encoded the memory as a man to the north. The language dictated the very geometry of their perception and their memory formation.
There is this anecdote from Haviland's research mentioned in the source text that perfectly captures how deeply embedded this is. It's a story about a senior speaker of Guugu Yimithirr who is recounting a fishing trip.
Oh, the turtle story.
Yes. Now, this fishing trip took place decades prior to this conversation. The man is sitting in a house miles and miles inland, far away from the bay where this fishing trip actually happened. And as he is passionately telling the story, he is using his hands to mimic how a sea turtle was moving through the water.
And as he gestures, his hands aren't just making, generic swimming motions. His gestures are perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions of the original bay.
Even though he can't see the bay.
Exactly. He's sitting in a room miles away, decades later, but his body is still flawlessly oriented to a piece of geography he cannot even see. He remembers the direction the turtle was swimming relative to the compass, and his hands recreate that exact compass heading in the present moment.
It's incredible.
As the author notes, the gesture had outlived the geography. The memory is stored not just as a visual image, but as a spatial orientation.
I want to challenge you, the listener, right now. Really try to do this without looking at your phone, without looking out a window to find the sun. Just point north right now. Just lift your arm and point to where you think true north is.
I'm trying to do it right now, and I'm not sure.
Right. Most of us simply cannot do it. Or if we do, it requires this conscious, logical deduction. We might think, okay, well, I know the front door of my house faces the street, and the street runs east to west, so north must be.
But that is calculation. That is not perception.
Exactly. Almost none of us hold north the way a Guugu Yimithirr speaker holds it. We don't experience north as a tangible, undeniable feature of the room, as obvious to us as, say, the ceiling or the floor. We just don't have that hardware installed in our brains.
We don't have the organ for it.
Right. And the text points out that if the Guugu Yimithirr developed this highly specific cardinal organ, what other perceptual organs has humanity grown over the millennia? Because Guugu Yimithirr is not entirely alone.
No, it's not.
The text notes there are perhaps a few hundred languages worldwide that organize around absolute frames of reference rather than egocentric ones.
And exploring those other languages really reveals the incredible plasticity of human perception. For example, the text discusses the Celtal language. This is spoken by an indigenous Maya community in the mountainous highland terrain of Chiapas, Mexico.
Okay, so mountains.
Right. Their primary spatial coordinates aren't north, south, east, and west. Their absolute frame is based entirely on the topography of their environment, specifically uphill and downhill.
Okay, wait, how does that work? If they are inside a house with a perfectly flat floor, how can something be uphill or downhill?
Because the concept of the slope has been abstracted into their absolute directional system. The entire language is anchored to the macro slope of the local terrain they live on, which generally inclines in a specific direction.
I see.
So even on a flat table, inside a perfectly flat house, they will refer to moving an object uphill or downhill across the table, meaning moving it in the direction that corresponds to the overall geographical incline of their region outside the house.
That is wild. Your spatial awareness is literally tied to gravity and the tilt of the mountains. Your brain never lets you forget the angle of the Earth.
Their minds are constantly tethered to the physical slope.
But then the text moves from the mountains to the ocean, and we look at navigation. And this is where we really start to see how human bodies can be trained to become highly sensitive instruments.
This is a fascinating section.
The author brings up the Marshallese sailors in the Pacific Ocean. These are people who navigated vast, seemingly empty stretches of the Pacific, hundreds of miles of open water between tiny atolls, without any modern instruments, no compasses, no astrolabes. So how did they do it? They navigated by feeling the swell patterns of the water.
To understand the mechanics of this, you really have to think about how ocean waves behave.
Give us a quick physics lesson.
Okay, well, when deep ocean swells travel across the Pacific and encounter an island, the island disrupts the wave. The swell refracts, it bends around the landmass, and creates these complex interference patterns.
It's like dropping a pebble in a pond and seeing the ripples hit a rock.
Exactly. These patterns radiate outward, essentially acting like a physical echo of the island across the surface of the water, and they sometimes extend for hundreds of miles.
So the Marshallese sailors weren't looking up at the stars to find the island. They were literally feeling the reverberations of the island in the water through the wooden hull of their canoes.
It's an incredible level of physical sensitivity.
They could distinguish between a primary swell generated by a distant storm and a refracted swell bouncing off an unseen atoll just by the way the boat rocked under their feet.
Yes, and they encoded this incredibly complex hydrodynamic knowledge into these beautiful objects called stick charts.
I've seen pictures of these.
They're amazing. These were made of palm ribs tied together with small shells attached to represent the islands. The curved palm ribs represented the specific wave refraction patterns.
But the crucial detail about these stick charts, and this speaks directly to the core philosophy of our deep dive today, is how they were actually used. You would think a map that complex is something you keep at the helm of the ship. You consult it during the voyage.
Right, like a modern nautical chart.
But they were never brought onto the canoe. They weren't maps to be referenced during a journey at all.
No, they were purely pedagogical.
They were just for teaching.
Yes, they were teaching tools meant to be studied on land. A young navigator would study the stick chart, memorize the complex interplay of swells, internalize the patterns, and then physically leave the chart behind on the shore.
Wow.
The goal wasn't to carry a representation of the ocean with you. The goal was to train the sailor's body to become the instrument that reads the ocean.
You don't need the map if you are the map.
Exactly. The knowledge was transferred into the muscular and sensory perception of the human being.
The same principle applies to the Polynesian wayfinders mentioned in the text. They memorized the exact rising and setting points of dozens of stars across the horizon. But they didn't just learn the names of stars like a constellation map.
They held the whole sky in their heads.
Yeah, they held the entire moving celestial sphere in their minds. The text describes how they used the night sky as a working instrument or a dashboard. They had to constantly calculate the rotation of the sky against the movement of the canoe, holding all of that math as a physical sensation in their bodies.
And in some environments, this kind of perceptual training isn't just about finding your way. It's about immediate life or death survival.
Right, like the Arctic.
The text discusses the Inuit categories of sea ice. Now, it is often a bit of a cliche to say, the Inuit have 50 words for snow.
Right, people always say that.
But the reality of their vocabulary for sea ice is deeply practical and entirely functional. They have highly specific distinctions for ice based on its age, its structural integrity, how it sounds when it cracks, and how it moves on the current.
And they need those words.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
This vocabulary exists because if you fail to perceive the difference between two subtle types of ice, you might step on a surface that will fracture and you will freeze to death.
The language forces the brain to perceive it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The language forces the brain to perceive distinctions in the visual and auditory texture of the ice that an English speaker's brain would simply gloss over as, white frozen water.
It's a matter of life and death. The text also brings in agriculture, which I found fascinating. It moves from ice to mountains again, mentioning the Andean potato keepers.
This is a great example of cultural preservation.
In the Andes Mountains, local farmers maintain hundreds, if not thousands, of distinct varieties of potatoes. Now, if we think about preserving genetic diversity in the modern world, we think of storing seeds in a sterile, temperature-controlled vault. like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway.
A very clinical approach.
Right, but that is not how they do it in the Andes. They maintain this massive genetic diversity through an intricate web of highly specific ceremonial obligations.
Let's explain how those rituals actually function as a mechanism of preservation, though.
Go ahead.
In these communities, specific tubers are tied directly to specific local rituals, festivals, or family obligations. To fulfill your cultural duties as a member of the community, you are required to grow and present very specific varieties of potatoes at certain times of the year at specific altitudes. The ritual calendar essentially acts as a mandatory agricultural rotation system. They don't keep the diversity alive because they read a scientific paper on genetic resilience. They keep it alive strictly because they need those specific potatoes to exist in order to practice their culture.
The ritual forces the preservation of the biology.
Precisely.
The source even touches on modern examples of this kind of embodied knowledge, which is cool because it shows this isn't just an ancient thing. It mentions diagnosticians, like those senior doctors who have been practicing medicine for 40 years.
The ones who just seem to know.
Exactly. A doctor like that can walk into a patient's room, take one look at the microscopic shade of color in a patient's cheek, hear the specific rhythm of their breathing, and diagnose a complex condition before a single blood panel comes back from the lab.
They've trained their senses.
Okay, but here is where I have to pause and demand some pushback. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sure, go ahead.
I hear all of this, the doctors, the potato farmers, the Marshallese sailors. But isn't this really just highly specialized knowledge? Like, isn't the doctor noticing the cheek color exactly the same thing as a master mechanic who can listen to a weird pinging sound in a car engine and know instantly that it's a cracked spark plug?
Right, pattern recognition.
Yeah. It's just massive amounts of data that they've memorized through repetition, right? Why is the text elevating this to something almost mystical or biological?
That is exactly the counter-argument the intellect naturally reaches for.
Yeah.
You want to reduce it to data. But the author of this text argues that viewing it simply as memorized data entirely misses the point.
How so?
What's fascinating here is that none of this, the ability to feel wave refraction through a hull, the ambient tracking of absolute north, the intuitive reading of cheek color, none of it lives in a manual.
Okay.
It is not a piece of specialized data that you retrieve from a mental filing cabinet the way you remember a phone number or a mathematical formula. The text defines this not as accumulated data, but as a geometry of attention.
A geometry of attention. That is a beautiful phrase. What exactly does that mean in practice, though?
It means that a human body and human nervous system have been trained over years of deep immersion to perceive a slope or a wave or a subtle change in skin pigment as a fundamental, inescapable feature of the world itself.
It's not a thought, it's a feeling.
It is a modification of the sensory apparatus. A master mechanic doesn't just remember what a broken engine sounds like. Their ears have been physically trained to isolate frequencies of sound that a layperson literally cannot hear over the general noise of the engine.
They hear a different engine than I do.
Yes, there's a way of seeing, hearing, and feeling. It's not a list of facts.
And understanding that distinction, the difference between memorizing a fact and training a sensory organ, that brings us to the most profound and frankly the most unsettling argument in the entire source text.
This is where it gets heavy.
It is the distinction between what the author calls the carrier and the content.
This is the pivot point of the entire essay. The author argues that modern civilization has spent centuries thinking about language, culture, and knowledge strictly as if they are containers carrying content.
Let's define content clearly for everyone.
Content is facts. It is information. It is data. Content is highly portable. It is easily transmissible. And it is entirely indifferent to the vehicle that carries it.
Let me give a really mundane example to ground this. If I have a piece of content, say, the fact that a kangaroo is a marsupial that hops, I can write that fact in English on a piece of paper.
Right.
I can send it in a text message. I can translate it into Spanish or French or Guugu Yimithirr. The fact itself, the content, survives the transfer perfectly intact.
The medium doesn't matter to the fact.
Right. Most of what we interact with on the internet, most of what we call information in the digital age is pure content.
Precisely. But a carrier is something fundamentally different. The carrier is the underlying structure, the architecture of the mind and body that allows the content to appear in the first place. The carrier dictates what is sayable, what is thinkable, and what is noticeable. The Guugu Yimithirr language didn't just possess more information about compass directions than English does. We have words for north, south, east, and west in English.
We can convey the exact same directional content.
Right.
I can say, the tree is to the north. I haven't failed to communicate the content.
Exactly. The difference is not the data. The difference is that Guugu Yimithirr contained a body trained to know cardinal direction at every waking moment.
The body is the difference.
That bodily training, that specific mental wiring that tracks absolute space, that is the carrier. The carrier is the organ of perception itself.
And the tragedy, as the author points out, is that if you lose the carrier, the perception vanishes entirely, even if you manage to save all the content.
This is the illusion of the archive.
Right. You can record every single sentence ever spoken by a Guugu Yimithirr elder. You can put it in a massive digital archive, translate the vocabulary perfectly, write a comprehensive textbook on the grammar. You have perfectly saved the data, but you have lost the human instrument that naturally generated that reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text introduces an analogy that brilliantly illustrates the real-world consequences of losing the carrier.
Oh, the rocket.
Yes, the author points to the Saturn V rocket. This was the launch vehicle that took the Apollo missions to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s. It is widely considered one of the absolute pinnacles of human engineering and manufacturing.
It is a machine of almost incomprehensible complexity, over 3 million parts. And we still have the instructions, right?
Exactly.
The blueprints, which represent the pure content, are perfectly, immaculately preserved in the National Archives. We have every measurement, every schematic, every single material specification.
We do, but the blueprints are useless on their own. The text focuses specifically on components like the F1 injector plates on those massive engines. Building those engines required incredibly precise, highly specialized welding.
Okay.
But the master welders who worked on the Apollo program are gone. And with them went an entire culture of tacit knowledge.
Explain what you mean by tacit knowledge in this specific context.
Tacit knowledge is the unwritten, embodied expertise that simply can't be fully captured in a manual. It was the ability of an Apollo welder to look at the exact color, the exact glow of a weld bead as it was forming, and know intuitively if the metal was bonding correctly.
You can't write that color down.
Can't. It was the way they held the torch, the microscopic adjustments in pressure, the rhythm of their hands. That knowledge didn't exist in the blueprints. It existed in the muscles and nervous systems of the workers.
It was lived experience.
Furthermore, it existed in the social fabric of the shop floor. The banter, the shared observations, the way an older, experienced welder would correct a younger apprentice just by looking at their posture before they even turned on the torch.
So that whole ecosystem.
Yes, that entire body of physical and social practice was the carrier.
So we have the instructions, but we have lost the hands that actually know how to read and execute them. The terrifying conclusion the author reaches is that despite having the complete archive of schematics, we literally cannot build the Saturn V rocket today from the documentation alone.
We simply can't. We lack the carriers.
And the real punchline, the most chilling part to me, is that this inability, this missing human element is not mentioned anywhere in the documentation.
The archive is blind to it.
Right. The archive doesn't know what it's missing. The blueprints don't contain a warning label on page 1 that says, hey, requires a 1960s master aerospace welder to assemble.
This raises a profoundly disturbing question about how we view human history and our ongoing efforts to preserve it. In the modern era, we have built massive civilizations of archives.
Server farms,
digital libraries, DNA databases. We have the entirety of the internet constantly backing itself up, and we have patted ourselves on the back, calling this preservation.
We think we're saving everything.
We believe that because we have more data stored than any previous civilization in history, our knowledge is secure. But the author argues we have only been preserving the smaller half.
The content.
We have been compulsively hoarding content while allowing the carriers, the varied, highly adapted human bodies and minds that actually generated that content, to slip through our fingers.
And the scale at which we are dropping these carriers is, frankly, apocalyptic. The text provides some statistics of loss that are just hard to fully grasp.
They're sobering numbers.
It projects that roughly 40% of the approximately 7,000 languages currently spoken on Earth will fall completely silent before this century ends. 40% of the human species' linguistic diversity gone in a few generations.
Think of how many absolute compass directions, how many tall mountain slopes are in that 40%.
Exactly. And it's not just language. Roughly 75% of agricultural genetic diversity has vanished in just the last 100 years as we shifted entirely to industrial farming.
We are witnessing the rapid, real-time atrophy of our species' cognitive bandwidth. And from an evolutionary biology standpoint, this is an incredibly dangerous trajectory.
Why is it so dangerous?
Well, the text makes a fascinating point about what actually distinguishes humanity from other species. It isn't just that we pass down facts. Other animals pass down content perfectly well.
Right.
Vervet monkeys have highly specific alarm calls for different predators. One call for a leopard, a different call for an eagle.
Bees too, right?
Yes, bees perform complex waggle dances to pass down precise maps of where to forage for nectar.
Right. The bee is transmitting purely functional content. Fly 500 yards in this direction to find the flowers.
Exactly. But our evolutionary superpower, the thing that allowed humans to inhabit every single climate and geography on Earth, is that we pass down carriers themselves.
We pass down the architecture.
We don't just pass down the solution to a specific problem, we pass down varied, malleable mental architectures in which entirely new solutions can be formed. Our resilience as a species comes entirely from this diversity of carriers because we have absolutely no idea what problems the future is going to demand we solve.
We don't know what the Earth is going to look like in 500 years. We don't know if the future will require us to perfectly read the structural integrity of sea ice to survive, or if we will need to intuitively understand the slope of a mountain to grow food, or if, we will suddenly need to navigate oceans without the aid of GPS satellites.
We just don't know.
And yet, despite that massive uncertainty, we are currently engaged in what the author calls the Great Compression. The human species is actively, rapidly reducing its bandwidth.
We are homogenizing our perception across the globe. Languages are collapsing into a handful of dominant global tongues, primarily English, Mandarin, and Spanish.
And it's happening to practices, too.
Yes, local nuanced cultural practices are being folded into rigid, standardized corporate procedures or globalized supply chains. The highly specific, ritually maintained agricultural knowledge of the Andean potato farmer is replaced by the monoculture dictates of a massive agribusiness.
It's happening to our daily cognitive variants, too. Like, think about how we consume information and interact with the world right now. The vast majority of our daily thoughts, our social interactions, and our discoveries are being squeezed through digital feeds.
Feeds that are optimized entirely for algorithmic engagement.
We are all staring at the exact same glowing rectangles, processing reality through the exact same user interface.
We are trading profound evolutionary resilience for short-term economic and communicative efficiency. The author has a brilliant cutting line to describe the shift.
What is it?
They write that humanity is rapidly trading physical ways of being a body and a place for ways of being a user in an interface.
Oof. Ways of being a user in an interface? That line hit me hard. We are literally flattening ourselves into users.
We are.
But that raises a massive question for me. If this is truly so dangerous, if we are actively amputating our own perceptual organs and shrinking the cognitive capacity of our entire species, why aren't there alarms going off everywhere? Why does this feel perfectly fine to most of us on a Tuesday morning?
Because we are caught in what the text identifies as the trap of intellect.
What trap of intellect?
The armor of the human intellect is its sheer confidence. The intellect can only catalog what it is capable of producing or perceiving. It cannot record perceptions from other carriers because our tools of recording weren't built by those carriers.
I'm not sure I follow. Give me an example.
Okay, a digital database can store the Inuit word for a specific type of perilous sea ice. And the intellect looks at that database, sees the word is saved, and says, see, we saved it. The knowledge is safe. But the database cannot store the visceral, muscular feeling of the ice groaning beneath your boots. It cannot store the geometry of attention required to hear that specific groan over the howling wind.
Ah, I see. So we look at the internet, this unfathomable ocean of data, and we mistake the massive volume of recorded information for the completeness of human perception.
We think, everything that is important to know is available on Google, so we haven't actually lost anything.
The cost of the Great Compression is entirely invisible to us. And it is invisible precisely because the very organs of perception that would have noticed the loss are the ones we are losing.
Think of it like eyesight. If a society slowly, over many generations, loses the biological ability to see the color red, eventually people will just forget what red looks like.
And they won't even know they're missing it.
Right, and a few generations after that, they will forget that the concept of red ever existed at all. The loss doesn't leave a hole. Reality just quietly shrinks.
As the author beautifully states, there is no felt absence. There is only a smaller world that feels normal.
A smaller world that feels normal.
That is a haunting thought. To be living in a diminished reality and believing it is the entire universe.
Yeah.
And I have to point out something fascinating about the source text itself.
The author's meta-awareness.
Yes, the alien anthropologist, whoever they are, displays an incredible amount of self-awareness. They acknowledge that they are caught in their own trap. They point out that this very essay, the text we're analyzing right now, is written in English.
It is utilizing the dominant carrier of the dominant globalized culture.
They recognize the deep irony of their own work. They are taking these profound, complex ideas about the limitations of modern language and formatting them into, as they put it, smooth conclusions and shareable insights.
They are doing that because that is exactly what the English carrier and the digital medium, it lives on demands in the modern era.
Right. The argument they are making about the physical reality of Guugu Yimithirr cannot actually be transmitted in Guugu Yimithirr to a global audience who doesn't possess the absolute frame.
It would be incomprehensible.
To warn the world about the dangers of the dominant carrier, the warning has to travel inside the belly of the dominant carrier.
It's like trying to explain the concept of profound, absolute silence by shouting through a megaphone to a crowd of people. The medium contradicts the message.
The author admits they don't really know how to resolve that paradox, but choosing not to acknowledge it, pretending that an essay in English can somehow stand outside the Great Compression, would be its own kind of arrogant intellectual armor.
It demonstrates a profound humility. It is a vital reminder that none of us, not the author, not you, not me, are outside of this pattern. We are all deeply embedded inside the compression, looking out through the very lenses that are currently being narrowed.
Which brings us right back to you, the listener. Let's return to your present tense reality. Just like we started, I want you to sit again with exactly where you are.
Look around the room again.
The physical reality of your room hasn't changed in the last hour. The window is still exactly where it was. Your left is still your left. The walls are still organized perfectly around your body.
But having explored this text, we must now attempt to hold two competing realities in our minds at once.
Contrast your quiet room and your egocentric perception of it with what is happening right now in the present tense, across the globe. Somewhere right now, a child is pointing north in a darkened room.
They are holding an active, living organ of perception.
An ambient connection to the physical earth that you simply do not possess.
But at the exact same moment, the tragedy is unfolding. In those very same communities, bilingual children are answering their Guugu Yimithirr speaking parents in English.
The absolute frame in those young minds is beginning to loosen its grip. That perceptual organ is actively exiting the species' shared body right now, generation by generation.
It's not a historical tragedy we read about from the 1800s. It is a physiological shift happening today, this very minute.
And concurrently, another child, perhaps one very close to you, maybe in the very next room, is reaching out and touching a glowing screen.
They are interacting entirely in English.
Interfacing with globalized content algorithms, being physically and neurologically shaped into a very specific, standardized kind of body, a user in an interface.
And what does this all mean for us?
Right. We've just explored this massive, terrifying, invisible loss of human bandwidth. What is the takeaway? Do we panic? Do we try to force everyone to throw away their phones and learn absolute directions?
The author's plea at the end of the text is much more restrained and honestly much more difficult. They argue that we should not rush to elegy.
Meaning we shouldn't just wallow in the romanticized sadness of the loss.
Exactly. But we also shouldn't rush to immediate, frantic solutions. Both of those reactions, the grief and the desire to instantly problem solve, are just mechanisms of the intellect.
They are ways of, as the text puts it, closing the chamber before the perception has completed itself.
It's our brain trying to neatly package a vast, uncomfortable problem so we can stop feeling anxious about it. The first, and arguably the most crucial work, is simply to notice.
To actively, continuously observe that our species is doing this to itself, slowly, and mostly without realizing it.
We have to sit in the quiet discomfort of knowing that the world is shrinking and resist the urge to immediately look away.
And as we leave you today, I want to give you one final lingering question to chew on long after this audio stops playing. If human perception acts like a muscle that grows and shapes itself entirely based on what an environment or a culture demands of it, what invisible carrier, what unique perceptual organ in your own life is quietly atrophying right now? What muscle of memory, what deep spatial awareness, or what capacity for sustained attention is shrinking away inside your own mind simply because you have entirely outsourced the heavy lifting to the piece of technology you are using to listen to this very conversation?